I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about what goes on beyond to the GM screen.
Behind the screen. Now, the GM screen is not just a physical object, but it has become sort of a metaphor. And because, some people play without GM screens in person, some people play online, in which case you don't have a physical screen probably, but you might either be rolling physical dice at home and people can't see it because you're at home, or you're doing it on a virtual tabletop in some kind of secret GM dice area where you can also put all your notes and prep on your computer and people aren't seeing it in the computer.
Yeah.
Traditionally, of course, GM screens have served as a way to sort of section off. Everything behind this screen is for the GM's eyes only.
So your dice and your notes and all that kind of stuff.
And so behind the screen is sort of a phrase that means the same thing as kind of behind the scenes for when you're having a behind the scenes look, or backstage for a theater production or something like that. It's sort of the secret information that makes the game run. And that's different than just talking about, specifically when to roll a secret die check. We have another episode that's about that. You can check it out on our GM Tools playlist. This is particularly about that sectioning off of information, what you put on which side, and what you can do with that secret information that's on your side of the GM screen. It hasn't been revealed to the players yet.
So one category we're often going to get this in is anything that pertains to what the characters are going to face in the future that the player, the characters themselves don't know about yet. So that's where you get your notes and your miniatures and things like that, or secret information that they don't have yet.
Campaign ideas, the secret truth about those NPCs the players have been talking to, the list of encounters that are on the random encounter table or that are in the local area, or the dungeon that the group is just about to head into. All of that kind of information first exists on your side of the GM screen. Of course, there should be ways in the game's fiction and the game's mechanics for the players to potentially take some of that information that's hidden and bring it over onto their side.
So whenever you have something that's behind the GM screen, that's a question you're going to want to be asking yourself. And this is something that, whether when you're writing a published adventure, or if you're using a published adventure or your own adventure, a story that is only in your head is not going to be as valuable as a story that you can share.
That's right.
Look for ways to get that information across. Maybe the players fail some of their checks and they're not going to discover everything necessarily, but as long as there's some way for them to figure that out.
Yes, just because the information is secret now does not mean that it should remain secret forever. In fact, it probably shouldn't. Now, sometimes it is true that you'll have to develop certain secret information that is very unlikely to show up on screen, but is just such a nucleus of cause and effect for other things that you needed to know it in order to make sense of everything else that's going on. But that is the exception that proves the rule, because beyond those rare few times, you always are going to want to try to think about at least how there's a possibility to share that information with the players. Because if they don't ever know about it, then really, it doesn't exist to them. The GM is the window into this fantasy world. You provide all 5 senses, plus extra weird senses like thought sense or life sense that the players have. And being a window doesn't mean that you reveal everything about the world. It means that you reveal, just like a window can only see a certain portion of the room in the house where the window is placed, you're only revealing a certain part of the world. Everything that is not visible through that window is kind of behind the GM screen.
And what you were talking about too with the with sort of the exception that proves the rule, it may be that the players don't discover, who is the master behind XYZ, but they can still this definitely all seems like these things are moving together, and then you need to make sure that you have this piece to determine that. There's also, like, when you reach the conclusion of a campaign, it's usually good to let the players know of those things that they didn't discover along the way.
The trouble is that depending on your group, they might not remember or care by that point. Whereas if they'd known it at the time, they would have. It's very important to, when you're deciding how to deal with GM screen secret information, is to know your group and your players. Mm-hmm. A lot of players are not going to remember really very much about the campaign. They're not going to remember very much about the background. They're not going to remember very much about any individual NPC. But you might have a player who's like me as a player who just remembers tons of the NPCs and a whole bunch of facts and who really wants to know all that information.
Well, another place
missed.
you can do that is kind of like when things fade out of like action relevancy, when it's like, okay, yeah, you finished this adventure here and you're like moving on to another town. But by the way, this other thing you didn't figure out was XYZ. And it's like, okay, yeah, well, our characters aren't going to go back and address that. So it's just like, aha, that's funny. That's how that worked.
That's right. So
because then it's a lot more proximal.
If you make it more proximal, then it's easier for the players to remember what else they were doing and then contextualize the information so they'll remember it over the long term. Whereas if the secret reveal came 5 months later in real life, by then it's going to be hard for them to sort of gel with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So ultimately, it's important to determine which piece of information that you're planning on giving for free or automatically, which ones you're planning on having be probably revealed, but it will depend on the results of the players asking to do something or rolling a certain check. What piece of information are hard to find out, and that there should be pretty few of those that you don't at least have some plan on revealing at some point later on down the line if the players do the right thing. And then once you've determined that, you can also decide which of these pieces of information are ironclad versus fungible. And by this I mean, if you have a notion for like a general plot that might be an adventure several adventures down the line, but you're not sure.
Yeah.
You haven't introduced any of the NPCs who are related to it yet. It's just sort of in your head. There's nothing that makes that idea so sacrosanct or canon that it would be considered to be like cheating or to be like unfaithful to the fiction if you just changed it later when you had a better idea or the players said something that inspired you.
Caveat. The one thing that is poor form with this is to have like players come up with a cool idea to address things, then to like realize, oh wait, I'm going to retcon that the enemies had a great way to get around this plan that the players had. Like,
yes.
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
Well,
but
the tricky thing with that is that you can have the players raise their eyebrows at you even if it wasn't a retcon at all. Like, if the players come up with a really great plan and the villains had exactly the correct countermeasure for that, it turns out the great plan just should not have worked, then you still might want to let them succeed, but you have to think about that. Because in that case, it kind of would be, especially if you've hinted that the villains have that capacity, but if they don't, if you haven't made any hints towards it, you're gonna have to decide between like
you might want to try
whether
to come
it
up with
seems shape or not.
a way to see if you can drop that kind of hint. Like, is there some kind of recall knowledge that they can do to figure that out, or some kind of way they can scope out the area to figure it out? I mean, it all depends on the social contract too. You some GMs might be like, they might have countermeasures against that, and be very heavy-handed with it, but.
Yes, or they might have just a generic countermeasure that it turns out that the PC's plans did not account for. And so you have to think about what you're going to do whenever you're shifting or adjusting your plans based on information you receive or even just new ideas you have.
Yeah,
over
but
time.
I do think that like making sure that you aren't doing that thing where you like retroactively shift things to be like, oh wait, no, your plan doesn't work. Because, like, if you are the kind of GM who is doing that, then players are definitely going to suspect you of doing that. Whereas if, like, one time their plan was foiled because the enemy planned against that, and other times their plans work great, then it's kind of like, okay, sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't.
Yes. So, like, to give an example, one time when I was running a campaign, the players had a really crazy plan that was a really weird, off the wall, and good way to solve a particular problem that they had, assuming that it was so outlandish that no one would have ever guessed that they were going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The problem was that there was someone who was scrying on the PC who was the cornerstone of the plan, and they kind of knew that someone was scrying on them. It was actually the Dark Elves who were mad because that player's character had really screwed them over previously, but they had gotten a whole lot of that character's blood and had been scrying on that character for a while. And so what happened was that the Dark Elves just completely saw the plan. It took a very long time to set up.
Mm-hmm.
And they just got in touch with the other villain who was involved with that plan, who was already one of their allies, and were like, hey, these guys are making like what seems like a 1,000-foot long immovable rod to try to triangulate where the orb that creates your anti-magic barrier is, and they're just like, yeah. And then the other villain is like, that is very strange. I don't even know how I would deal with that other than to just, you tell me when they're about to do this plan, and then I'll just have to move it slightly after they've already started going down. And so that would happen, and and I was even a little sad because it was such a crazy plan that would be funny if it worked. And the players were also kind of sad, but it was also like they did know that someone was scrying on them, and they thought it was probably the Dark Elves, who they knew were allies with that villain.
And then their plan took a long time to execute.
Yes, they spent a long time crafting the rod, and then they also practiced using it.
Yeah. You know what would have been hilarious is if they used that fact that they were being scryed on to come up with a fake plan.
Yes, that would have been really funny. And then they talked about everyone who was not that character got together and like, okay, the barbarian's not here. So what's the real plan that whoever's scrying on us can't see? Because obviously it's not this 1,000-foot long immovable rod.
Yep.
Come
up with all these plans while the barbarians there that are really expensive and complicated to counteract.
Yes.
And draw resources away from your actual plan.
So when you are talking about the information that is behind the screen, obviously we got into the sort of the more complicated, which is like your long-term plans and how they might shift if you come up with a new idea for an adventure, or the players think of something, or they just get more interested in a certain NPC or theme than you expected them to be. But the one that always comes up in these videos, and we didn't want to start off with because we wanted to give some of the basic principles of GM screens and hidden information, is the short-term information like dice rolls.
Yes.
So you have rolled dice, you have made some proximal decision that is about to ripple and affect the campaign world right now. And so you know what it is. The players do not. And the question becomes, what is the correct GM move when those dice results seem like just really less interesting than like some other results? So for our group, we keep it because the dice are part of telling the story. The unpredictability of the dice and just going with the flow and figuring out what to do next, that's part of the fun. And it's not a railroaded situation.
Sometimes there are ones in large strings, and sometimes there are terrifying numbers of crits.
Yes. And sometimes the D100 gives you a weird percentile result where you're like, oh, there's a 1% chance of this, and then it happens.
Yep.
You never know what it's going to do, and that's part of the joy for our group.
Yeah, but sometimes, sometimes a devil tries to run away after killing priestesses of Sheldon and accidentally opens a portal into Sheldon's domain.
It was on a random 1D100 table, and you can see that on Linda's Adventures Council of Thieves, which is one of our other videos. But it's just one of the joys over time of playing for us. But not every group is like that. If your group gets together, has a talk, and your social contract is, if the die result is just really lousy and really unlikely, like, let's say an early time player is coming in, and then you roll a crit, and it's like, well, if both of these 2d8 are 8, it will do exactly enough damage to just instant kill their character from fall.
Yeah.
And then they were both 8, which is 1 in 64 chance. And then maybe your group social contract is you say, it was 8 and a 6.
Yeah, okay. You're still down, but
our group doesn't do that.
Yeah.
But yours might, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's what your group wants.
Yeah.
But if you just do that without communicating with the rest of your players or asking them, you could cause some serious friction or problems down the line if the players actually ever find out. We had one player who was even the more adamant than average for our group. It was just like that would be like such a betrayal of trust.
So there was even like one time when there was some unlikely rolls, and then we wound up having to retire a die because he was too suspicious.
Because the die was just.
Because we're like, at this point, we're like, maybe this die is actually not a fair d20.
We decided it might just be weighted because of the fact that it wasn't even that it got a lot of 20s or 1s. It just had a suspiciously high number of rolls that were missing in a row. And we all saw it. We didn't have a GM screen.
Yeah, it was just there.
It was being rolled out in the open. Everybody looked and saw what the die was doing. Yeah. But if there had been a GM screen, I'm sure that player would have assumed that I was just making those numbers up because I can't make up numbers that are as outrageous as that die rolled.
Yeah, no, like with our group, the more important the roll, the more you roll it to the center of the table so everyone can see it and be like, oh, what's going to happen?
Absolutely.
Though, I have done some, what you were talking about there in terms of like fudging damage numbers, not with our home group, but sometimes when I'm running for groups that are like, this is new players, or like, this is a table of kids, or like that kind of thing. It's like, yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't do that, even with new players and a table of kids, unless it specifically is a situation where, like, I discuss ahead of time and are like, hey, we're just doing a learning game for this, so it's kind of like a tutorial. I'll like roll things back if there's some issues. I'll let them know that that's what I'm doing. I won't tell them, yeah, this is the full game. We're going for the full experience, and then secretly pull things away.
Yeah, I feel like if there was a group like that I was running for consistently versus like for me, if it's just like a single like event game at a convention that's like a weird circumstance, and sometimes I might be like, that was incredibly unlikely and is going to make it suck. And, like, there's special circumstances with this player.
Yeah, usually if I find that I have a group like that, I'll just try to make it easier in the first place. But this all comes down to your own GM style. And also the style that your group appreciates. So, there's no right or wrong answer to that. You will see, I'm sure, YouTube videos out there on both sides telling you, you're doing it wrong. If you ever fudge, you are a cheater. You've cheated your players out of a true experience, and you should feel ashamed of yourself. And I'm sure you could find other videos out there that'll be like, you're doing it wrong. If you're not fudging the dice to make the game fun, the only thing that matters is fun, and you could determine dice results that are the most fun instead of just being stuck with whatever the dice actually give you.
Another one that I've sometimes done is, like, usually in our home group, if you're like, oops, I made a mistake, and then you tell the whole group, like, oops, we made this mistake, let's try to roll things back. But sometimes it's really complicated, and sometimes I'll be thinking, like, oh crap, like, XYZ attack that the players did a while ago should have hit, Well, that would have done about 20 damage, so I'm just going to knock 20 off of their hit points or what have you. So I feel like it's fine to kind of do like good faith corrections to like what should have happened as well.
I think correcting things when you've messed up is generally a good call. It depends on your group's social contract again. Our group does correct things, but there's some who are just like, well, if the mistake was made and you don't catch it right away, then you don't correct it.
But that's because our group will legit like roll back the clock in multiple rounds to try to fix things sometimes, and so sometimes I'm like, rolling back the clock's going to take too long. I know our group likes
or it can break momentum or other things like that. Obviously, if it's just 20 damage, rolling back won't take very long because you just say, hey guys, you should have hit back then and done 20 damage, so I'm just going to apply 20 more damage. But there's sometimes situations where it would cause a significant issue because it's like, well, no, because that person should have missed who, instead of hitting and disrupting that spell, if that spell had gone off, it would have healed this person who would have woken up and had an extra turn.
This to me might be more like, well, they should have an extra +1 this entire time, so they probably would have gotten one more hit, which probably would have been about this, and like, you know.
And sometimes you can have that chain of events, like the one I just said, where it's like, well, they should have missed not dealing damage or disrupting the spell, and the spell was a healing spell that would have woken this person up, who would have gotten a turn then, and if they got a turn then that could have preempted this other thing from happening, and then you're just like,
I also
what am
feel
I
like
do?
The amount that we care about this stuff is highly dependent upon how, like, tight the combat is. If it's an easy fight, we're just, like, only bother fixing if it's egregious and easy, and a quick fix. But like if it's a harder fight, then we definitely would be more like, okay, let's go back and figure all this stuff out.
So basically, the secret to having your own special space, your GM screen, whether it's a physical screen or a metaphysical screen or metaphorical screen, any of those kinds of screens, is to first, before you set that screen down, before you create that boundary of space between yourself and the players, is to lift it up, talk to everyone, and figure out what is the secret space behind your screen going to be like? What is it okay to change?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's some point where it is okay to change things. I don't think there's any group in existence who believes that if you ever brainstormed something and typed it out in a notepad file or even just had it in your head
then it must be
as an idea
better.
for later on in the campaign, then it must be that, and you literally can then never change what the idea is, even though you hadn't even completely finished it. You didn't draw out the dungeon, and when you did, you realized that there was no water in that idea that you had, and that all the animals that lived there would die or whatever. No group would go that far. On the other hand, some groups actually might go all the way to the opposite direction of anything can change at any time, but most groups have some unwillingness to change things, at least once they've already been out there and stated as an assumption for a long time.
Because once something is... I generally tend to think of it as, like, once information passes to the players, I'm not going to change it unless I really need to, and then I'm going to talk to the players about it and, like, give them a chance to retcon or change whatever they need to respond to it. If it's behind the screen, then it, in terms of, like, plot stuff and things like that, then it's still fungible. And one of the things we've talked about in the past is if you're just, like, if you're thinking, I haven't really figured out what I'm going to do for XYZ yet that's in 3 sessions. And then, like, a player speculating about, like, oh, I think that the deal with XYZ is blah. And you're thinking, damn, that's cooler than what I was thinking. Like, for our group, definitely just, like, picking that up and making it be the truth is totally acceptable. And then it's just like, oh, that character was smart. They figured it out.
So if you're thinking about where do I draw that line, because the two extremes are pretty extreme, here's my suggestion. My suggestion is, if it has happened, whether or not the players know that it has happened, but if it is in your head, in the adventure, it has already happened. You rolled that check, you know what the result is. Or let's say you've been doing a dungeon where, I don't know, there's a creature that's hiding in secret rooms and flipping switches that's moving around the dungeon. And then you later just are thinking, well, maybe there shouldn't have been a creature doing that. But you did have it happening before, and it did have some influence, even if maybe players didn't find out. So it's not technically too late to change it. But from my perspective, and this is my own personal aesthetic, once you've had it happen, even if it's hidden, then I don't go back from it. Whereas if it hasn't happened yet, like it's an idea for an adventure 3 adventures from now, and I haven't established that there even is a dungeon in that lake where I was going to have it be, then I can change it anytime.
So I would consider for that one that, like, I would keep the creature, but if I find, like, oh, I just had it being this, like, I just had it being ghoul, but, like, I found this cool undead from this other book that maybe it could be the thing that's flipping the switch. Because then, like, the core idea of there's an undead that's going around that's flipping the switch would still stay the same. But if previously it was a mummy and the PCs had found a scrap of mummy fabric that allowed them to, gave them a hint that it was a mummy, then I would say, well, now it's definitely a mummy.
As for me, the moment that I rolled that ghoul's stealth check to determine whether or not the players noticed that it was flipping the switch.
Oh, then you rolled a check, so you've determined
Then it's happened.
Yeah. Then it's locked because you know what its stealth modifier is. Yeah.
Now,
I was
it is completely reasonable for other GMs to be like, well, yeah, but you made it with the ghoul stealth check, and the mummy has an even better stealth check, so it would have made it anyway. That's completely fair. That's just not how I roll, but if you roll that way, I think that works great. And you probably don't even really have to ask your group about things where you're like sort of changing the plot of things they don't know yet, because die roll changing or fudging is the one that really can get players angry if you do it without talking to them.
And like to sort of go back to like the example, right? You wouldn't want to be like, oh, I've just realized that I'm changing this to a creature that's resistant to fire instead of weak to fire because I have a character who seems to be liking to prepare a lot of fire spells lately. Like, yeah, you don't do that.
Yes. Similarly, and the reason why, like, obviously changing the ghoul to the mummy is not going to make anyone upset. I just draw the line of once it's happened, unless I talk to the players and say, let's do a retcon. Because here's a similar example with the ghoul and the mummy. Suppose you have a murder mystery, and the players have actually only found enough clues that they winnowed it down from 12 suspects down to 6. Or they could. Maybe they didn't think of the fact that 2 of those 8 that they currently have it in should have been eliminated. But you know that with the clues they have, if they think hard, they should eliminate it down to 6. And then later you decide to change it between 2 of those ones in the 6, and then remove a clue they technically didn't look at yet, and then add a different clue so it's a different person. I personally wouldn't like that, but I think that it is a reasonable thing to do in some groups.
Whereas I consider that to be fair game because everything that the players have seen is consistent. And some of those like mystery type plots can be really tough, and sometimes later on you'll discover that you have a hole in the story, and then you're trying to like figure out a way to patch that hole. So you're like, okay, this is a way to patch the hole that's consistent with everything that the players have seen thus far.
Because I wouldn't want to do that, since as I was role-playing the suspects, I would have been initially role-playing them, knowing that one of them was the murderer and not the other one. And so then I would feel like when I later switched it around, that first impression where even I did not know that person was the murderer was like maybe like not the impression that I would have wanted to give, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, but I can see that perspective.
It's totally dependent on you. Even Linda and I differed in that one. That's the reason why these are such a personal, and I don't mean just for you, but personal for your group as a whole, way of deciding how things roll.
Yeah, for sure. Because I feel like, for me, that works better for like my style of the way that I improvise things. Is to be able to realize, oh wait, this isn't quite working, let's fix this. So that's why for me it's very much like when the players learn it, it is locked. If there is a roll, like we were saying with the roll, like if there's a roll that happened, that is locked and the results should be the same. But like if it hasn't come into contact with the players in any way, I figure like in that case.
Well, what if the players at the very start rolled to sense motive on everybody? And you rolled it, and let's say just for the sake of argument, they failed every check.
Yeah.
So you just said, nobody looks suspicious. And they would have failed even with the new murderer that was previously not the murderer. They would have failed on them anyway.
Yeah.
But because the roll happened, would you lock it in, or would you say no?
I would say that that's fine because it's not going to be inconsistent with anything that the players know because they failed every single check.
But they don't know that they failed the check.
They don't know that they failed every single check, but the world state doesn't change with respect to like the information that they have.
What if they had succeeded on the check of the person that you wanted to change to be the murderer, but you also thought reasonably that just sensing motive maybe wouldn't have sensed like I am the murderer as their motive in that conversation?
I would say that you're probably that's probably too shaky then at that point, because then you probably, if they had been the murderer at that time, would have given some hint that they were nervous or like evasive or what have you.
What if when you roleplay you tend to try to give some of those little hints for the person who is the murderer. So that's sort of my situation.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you knew that you didn't. Because you didn't think that was the murderer at the time. And would the answer change depending on whether the person who you later changed to be the murderer was like super slick sociopath who would be really good at never giving any
I think that I would consider someone who like should have dropped an obvious hint by then to be someone who isn't a valid candidate for being switched to being the murderer. But like it would be valid to switch to someone who was slick enough that there wouldn't have been any sign.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see from two different perspectives on this, you need to be able to...
I think our perspectives are actually pretty darn similar.
They're close, but they're different that question.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We are able to narrow it down, even though we're pretty on the same side of the screen, into a point where even we give different answers, which shows that you need to be able to develop your own individual, independent GM style and thinking style. This is not going to be the same as a lot of these videos that might tell you, this is the way to GM. If you do this, you're right, and other things are wrong, because the answer is, there is no one right or wrong answer.
Yeah.
It's only what feels right to you, what feels comfortable to you, what feels authentic, and what your group feels makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the bottom line. You can have a screen, and you can even keep a lot of roles or information behind it. But if your players trust you, then it'll work out. And if they don't trust you, then even if you don't have a GM screen, they might think that something funny is going on.
I see. One thing I am realizing I struggle with as a GM is trying to avoid rooting for the PCs. I have to remember I'm not in the party when I'm GMing.
So the GM, I think it's good to be a fan of the PCs. Be a fan of the players and their characters. But you're the type of fan who is like, I don't know, maybe you're like Syndrome in the Incredibles, where you're a fan, but you also are putting these big dangerous things in front of them to watch them fight them. And, probably defeat them, but you want to see if they can defeat them or not.
Yeah. You want to see them level up and get stronger through their challenges and develop in their story. So I would say, like, I think it's totally cool to root for the PCs and be like, yeah, when they succeed. But as long as that doesn't cause you to be like, I'm rooting for the PCs and therefore I'm going to have all of my NPCs pull their punches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are rooting for the PCs, but those enemies you're playing are not.
Mm-hmm.
The dragon's not going to suddenly turn its head to the side and not do a breath weapon that hits the whole party if they're standing in a breath weapon formation.
Yeah.
It's going to breathe on the whole party.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is very, very
No,
important.
I definitely wince when my dice are hot as a champ. I crit again, sorry.
You just have to play the authentic role of those adversaries while still rooting for the players and their characters. Or you can be the type of GM who doesn't root for the players and their characters if that's your style. You can be the one who is the mock villain who is just like, I'll get you next time, you fools! And really, maybe secretly you're rooting for them. Or maybe you're not. Maybe you legitimately think you'll get those fools next time. I don't know.
As long as you're being fair.
As long as you're being fair, man. All right. So those are the key tips to making that GM screen into sort of your own personal little blockade for the window that you put into this fantasy world. If you take those and develop your own styles, you're going to be great. And you're going to be able to run a game that's better than any game that you could play where you just followed an advice video that told you there was one answer and just ran through that unless you lucked out and the advice video told you the exact answer that worked well for you and your group, which is very unlikely. So, with that being said, everyone, thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe, or even join if you're really into it and you want to support us. And
we're going to get some XP to our live viewers, as as take a look here at what folks... So it looks like Math Guy voted for 3 in our poll.
He sure did.
Our episode a week from today. So if anybody else has an opinion about what they'd like us do. 3 being to
3
another
being
vote for
player
3.
tools choosing the
Player
right
tools
spells.
choosing the right spells, because we've talked about spells selection and like, oh, you might want to have some lists of spells or whatever, but like what actually goes into that.
All right, it looks
we
like
have more votes
we
for
have
3.
multiple
All
votes
right.
for choosing the right spells for players. You know what? We've done enough GM tools.
Player
Let's do
tools
something
get-
for players.
There we go.
Next Tuesday, we're going to do the player tools. We're going to put on our wizard hats, and we're going to figure out what the right spells would be.
I only have a witch hat.
Well, we're going to put on Linda's witch hat, and we're going to figure out what the right
I
spells
help me
would
remember
be.
to dig that out of the Halloween box.
Okay, I was talking metaphorically, but we're going to literally put on a witch hat for this one. So be sure not to miss on Tuesday. Also, on Saturday, we're going to do something else. I think
Random
it
tables,
involves
I think?
random tables.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and the ugly of random tables. How to make them awesome for your game instead of a problem. So join us either of those 2 days if you're interested, or maybe even if you're not, I guess you could join us and be like, this is uninteresting. Why am I watching this? That's okay. That's still a view. We'll take it. Have a good week. See you next time.